Alrighty, welcome everybody to a theory that has been in the works for a very, very long time. This is my soul theory that I originally proposed in April of this year. It was after my weakest genocide route video. I said that I would be either making next a highest EXP for Undertale Yellow or a soul video, and then whichever one got voted in a poll I held, whichever one got voted the least would be made after whichever got first. The Undertale Yellow video got first, so I made that one, and since then there has been no word on this video, and that is my fault. I deeply apologize for that. I can explain though. Essentially, this video was in scripting hell. I was trying to make a script fit. I was trying to work around the theory. When I originally proposed it to you guys, I only had the skeleton of a theory, and as I was trying to sort of flesh it out, it did not necessarily end up going the way I had expected it to. Essentially, and it's not that that I sort of found evidence to disprove it, but rather there was just a lack of evidence for it in general, so I knew it was going to be extremely hard to convince anyone of this theory. So eventually, obviously, I am a nerd, especially with Deltarune and Undertale, so this theory that I had originally proposed in April morphed over the course of, I suppose it's been 6 months, so it morphed over the course of 6 months into the theory that I'm presenting to you today. We're going to talk real quick. I want to go over something because, as you can see, this is, and I'm doing this on a slideshow because I just find it to be easier, because I can look at things and I can point to them. It's very good, and I actually got the concept from Flygon. I don't know exactly how to pronounce his name, but if you guys know who I'm talking about, you know who I'm talking about. He does these style videos, and I decided to throw a section at the beginning because there's actually something that I wanted to make another video about. I draft a lot of videos, and very few of them end up actually seeing the light of day, but one that I wanted to talk about is that there's an actual order of souls that appears a couple times throughout the game, and I haven't actually seen anyone point it out, but this is the order. I actually have it in reverse because it is reversed in Deltarune, but basically the order is light blue, orange, blue, purple, green, yellow, and red. The first instance we see this order is that, I don't know why Anyway, it's the Omega Flowey fight. The order in which you fight the 6 human souls in the Omega Flowey fight is the same. It's light blue, orange, blue, purple, green, yellow, and then obviously red is the soul you play as, so you don't really fight that one. But it could be considered the final section when all of the souls heal you. But anyways, this pattern actually does reappear, as I said, in the order that you find the items that belonged to the 6 fallen humans, and actually technically the 7, which we'll get to at the end, but the first one is the light blue soul, whose items you find in ruins. Then the orange soul, you find their items in Snowden. The blue soul, you find their items at the beginning of Waterfall, sort of the first area where it's actually like waterfalling, and then the second area of Waterfall, sort of after the trash dump, you see here, you actually buy them from Gerson. You can purchase the purple human souls items. Then the green soul, their items are found in Hotland. The yellow soul, their items can obviously be bought from Bratty and Catty right before the core, right after Hotland, sort of that between area at the MTT resort. And then actually you can find technically a red soul's items being Kara's worn dagger, and I am going to be referring to the first fallen human as Kara. Just if that confuses any of you, just know I'm just doing it for simplicity's sake. Anyways, technically the locket, most people assume is Azrael's, myself included, but you could say that it might be Kara's. Anyways, I bring this up to say that it is a repeating pattern, and I feel it can't be a coincidence that the same order you find their items is the order that you fight them, and there's actually a third way to spin this order relating to Deltarune, although I will admit this is flimsy at best, at least given what we currently know, but given what we've seen so far, this can, and obviously I said it's reversed in Deltarune, so I had it in the Deltarune order here. Obviously, in Chapter 1, every single enemy you just fought with a red soul. There were no soul modes. However, in Chapter 2, you actually are able to fight Spamton, and in that fight, you use the Yellow Soul. And the fact that there are 7 Deltarune chapters, at least that we have confirmed so far, and there are 7 human souls seems pretty suspect. It seems pretty likely that it just happened to be that Jevil, the first secret boss, had to use the Red Soul, which is the first one. So it would be Jevil Red, Spamton Yellow, as we've seen, and has been confirmed. So theoretically, the Chapter 3 secret boss would use the Green Soul, and then you get, in Chapter 4, you get Purple, Chapter 5 would be Blue, Chapter 6 would be Orange, and Chapter 7 would be Light Blue. And what's interesting about this, actually, is that the 2 soul modes that we've never actually played as would be saved for last, which is sort of water to support this theory. Obviously, with 2 out of 7, there's not really any... we can't really say that this is confirmed, how it's going to play out. But it is looking like it may be leaning in that direction, which is the unused soul modes. So you see, obviously, here the orange and the blue, they don't actually have soul modes where your soul changes to this color in a fight. So you never actually play as the orange soul or the light blue soul, but you can see sort of associations with them. So obviously here you have the lasers, which obviously the bravery soul. And then if you see an orange attack like Asgore uses, or like this laser, you have to be brave and run through it. You have to be moving through an orange attack. Same with a light blue attack, which you see here with the laser, or with Papyrus's attacks, or this doggo sword. You have to be patient, and you have to stand still. Basically, I'm going to be relating these 2 soul modes to... they are very important, relating them to Susie and Chris. Now, what do I mean, before we get into the absurdity of that statement, what do I mean when I say relating to? Well, for Chris, it could be obvious to say that Chris is the light blue human, or maybe that they are just a light blue soul in Deltarune, and it doesn't show because we are inhabiting their soul, or something of that nature. But basically, I'm going to start with Chris, and I'm going to be providing every single evidence that I can of Chris being represented by the light blue soul. Now, what do I mean by represented? I just mean that the attributes that are attributed to the light blue soul, so patience, and then there are some other things we're going to get into, those heavily tie into Chris. And the reason this is important, because after we get through Chris and Susie, which definitely have the most evidence, we're going to go through the rest and see if we can relate them to other main characters in Deltarune. We're going to start off. Evidence number 1 for Chris being the light blue soul is pretty simple. The color of the light blue soul is the same color as Chris's skin in the Dark World. The Dark World sort of changes things into maybe imaginatively what they could be. So for Lightners, it enhances their appearance, and it's very strange that it changes Chris to blue, because it could show that this is how they feel. This is an inner representation, or this is an outer representation of how they feel on the inside. The second piece of evidence is the actual items that we know were used by the blue soul. So here we have the knives that were found in the ruins and used again in the light blue soul's attack. Obviously, we see Chris very prevalent with knives. It's a very core part of their character. From what little we know about them, the 3 times we've seen them without a soul, all 3 times I believe they've taken their knife out. Obviously, the end of Chapter 1 and the end of Chapter 2, they open a Dark World. And I believe they have it as well in the prologue when they slash the tires. They have to have the knife. Anyways, it's just very interesting. And obviously, knives are also associated with Kara. I believe that's a red herring, because obviously Chris dresses very similarly to Kara. This is only due to the fact that Chris is a dreamer child, and they all wear yellow and green shirts. Chris has yellow skin, which is actually more associated with Frisk, and red eyes, which are also associated with Frisk. Although people think you're possessed by Kara when you have the red eyes as Frisk, but I actually believe, since we never see Frisk's eyes, that they, much like Chris, just have naturally red eyes that they hide through their hair. It's a very interesting dynamic, and shows that Chris could be a grown-up Frisk. Probably not, but it's just interesting the parallels between both characters. Obviously, the knife, which most people immediately associated with Kara, could be associated with the light blue soul. We move on to the third piece of evidence, which is the ribbon, which is obviously used by the light blue soul, which we see in the ruins as well. This one is a bit flimsy because this is obviously dialogue from Ralsei. It's when we first find armor. In the Dark World, it's a ribbon, although I believe the ribbon we find in this instance is a white ribbon, although there is a red ribbon you can find later in the cyber world. Just thought I'd mention that Ralsei specifically finds a ribbon and tells Chris to equip it, which is very interesting, because it could, in hindsight, if we find out that Chris is in some way related to the Light Blue Soul, it could sort of show early, subtle foreshadowing of that. The next evidence, which is a bit better, is the association with bandages. Obviously, that's the armor we start out with in Undertale, and as well, there is a bandage that Chris has equipped in Deltarune. I showed this real quick just to show, because I think it's interesting. I'm pretty sure that in the Dark World, Chris's bandage becomes this sort of pink, I don't know, it looks like a tablecloth. It's probably more of like a short little cape. But also, and this is the orange soul. This is due to some weird programming thing, but I promise the bandages are used by the Light Blue Soul to heal you in the Omega Fly fight, which is very interesting because it's the only instance we have of association of bandages with the Light Blue Soul. Obviously, unless you consider Chris, in which case they have a bandage. There's no association for Chris's pencil, which is fine because I wouldn't expect to find a pencil probably anywhere in Undertale. But anyway, we're going to go to what is, in my opinion, definitely the most concrete piece of evidence, which is the actual description. We're going to read our first description. This is the light blue flag. It describes ball is small, so obviously we'll talk about more what that means later, but it says, you waited still for this opportunity, then dethroned ball with a sharp attack. Wow, this is a lot to go over, and it's a very specific, very specific wording. Ball, in quotes, is small, in quotes. Now, obviously, ball, we've seen before, has been associated with what we said was the player. I'm going to actually, since it's red, associate it more with the red soul, specifically that is possessing Frisk, or that is being used to possess Frisk. Whatever you believe. Anyway, so if we read into this like a metaphor, it would say the red soul is, and small could be reinterpreted as sort of meek or sort of resting. It's weak. So the red soul is weak. You waited still for this opportunity. And obviously, as we see, Chris does wait for this opportunity to dethrone the red soul, because they wait the entire day through our adventures, through all of Chapter 1, and then finally, at the end of Chapter 1, during the middle of the night, they finally wait for their opportunity and then dethrone or remove from position of authority the red soul. So they rip out the red soul, dethroning it from ownership of their body with a sharp attack. And technically, I pointed it to the knife, but Chris doesn't use the knife to rip the soul out, although I would assume their nails or their fingers would have to be pretty sharp to be able to reach into their chest and rip out a soul. But anyways, just the association of the knife in the same scene that this flag could very well be describing is very interesting, and it seems almost intentional. Now, I should mention at least that the sharp attack could just be relating to the toy knife that we know was used by the Light Blue Soul, but it just seems a bit coincidental. Now, I actually want to talk before I get here. Actually, we'll cover this last piece. Basically, it's just that patience. Oh, this actually does relate to what I was about to say. I saw someone else sort of presenting this theory. It was on Reddit, I believe, and the only, I think, association between what I'm going to say that my theory and their theory shared was that Chris was the patient soul. The comments were almost full of people saying Chris is not the patient soul. How do you get Chris as the patient soul? Most of it was actually just geared towards calling Chris impatient, or just saying Chris is not, at least what we know, to be a patient person. Obviously, I've already gone through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces of varyingly confident evidence that Chris could be related to the Blue Soul. However, just the fact that they are a patient person, I think calling Chris impatient or calling them not patient is sort of a huge misdiagnosis. What we see is them wait the entire day through Chapter 1 just so they can rip out their soul. And for what? Well, the only actual difference is that, so they wait till the middle of the night, and then seemingly all they did was eat a pie, but it actually shows that During Chapter 1, the TV was not plugged in at the end of the day, but at the beginning of the day in Chapter 2, the TV is plugged in. It's dusty could imply something about, like, Azrael's dust or something. I don't know. Ask Jaru about it. But what I'm focusing on here is the fact that Chris, quite clearly, in between the night, plugged in the TV, which obviously is very much related to what we will see later, which they also wait an entire day for. At the end of Chapter 2, when they finally turn on the TV and create a dark world, we'll see exactly where Chris's plot with that goes, with the whole plugging in the TV. Obviously, it has something to do with not wanting to be possessed by the soul anymore, but I'm not here to predict where it's going. I'm just here to show, look, this is a pretty patient person, right? They're waiting entire days just to make small steps. Obviously, you could say they're waiting still for this opportunity to dethrone the soul for good. Now, I do have to mention what is so special about the patient soul, because, I mean, this is just more of a side note, but I thought it was interesting to note that the patient soul is the only one who has their items, obviously, found in the ruins, but it's interesting because the ruins is barricaded and gated, and the QC in Snowden says that the door's been locked for ages, and the only way to get through it is to be a ghost or to burrow under it. At least that's the only way to get in. So, theoretically, it would not make sense for the light blue soul, whose stuff we know is in the ruins, to have they obviously would not have dropped their stuff and left the ruins without it. So presumably they would have been killed in the ruins, but I don't see that happening because obviously Toriel would not allow anyone to pass through the ruins with a dead child's soul. So this is just sort of a side theory about Undertale once more. But basically, my theory is that the light blue soul was the first one to fall after Kara's death and after Asgore's declaration of war on the humans, and that actually Toriel didn't move into the ruins until Asgore had killed his first child, who was the patient soul. So obviously the ruins were still open at this time, so they were either killed in here or they were captured. Their stuff was left here because they wouldn't need to bring it to the capital, and then they were brought to the capital and killed by Asgore, which prompted Toriel to retreat into the ruins to protect humans. Anyway, just a small little tangent about that. I believe, in my opinion, provided sufficient evidence to suggest that there is a direct link between Chris and the light blue soul. Especially the strongest thing, the one that gives me the most confidence is this, just with how much it connects. But anyway, we're going to be moving on now to Susie. This is evidence for Susie being the orange soul. First off, you have her Dark World uniform, which obviously for Chris, it just changed the color of their entire face to light blue. But for Susie, it actually gives her orange accents. You can see here her eyes are orange. And the biggest part is this orange belt buckle, which sort of is in the shape of a heart. And I pasted the orange soul over here so you can see the similarities. And you can see, and actually I did bring receipts. You can see, first off, you can see that this belt buckle is a heart. This is official Deltarune art. This is on the Chapter 1 vinyl. I don't think this was done by Timmy. This doesn't really look like her style. But the point is that this is a soul. And also, I actually noticed this a couple hours ago when I was going over these slides. Chris, and the rest of the gang too, but Chris specifically is standing in the middle of this light blue soul. So I don't know if this was sort of fan interpretation of the person who made the official art, or if this was approved by Toby. But if this was approved by Toby, I mean, this basically tells us that Susie is in some way associated with the orange soul, and it would strongly suggest that Chris is associated with the light blue soul. I'm obviously done talking about Chris and the light blue soul. However, there is even more evidence for Susie. First off is that one of the weapons available to Susie and Susie only is the Brave Axe, which Brave is obviously the trait associated with the Orange Soul. And speaking of Brave, you can obviously tell that Susie is a brave person. And we'll get to this again. These flag descriptions, all of them are oddly specific to the character that I can relate them to. Anyways, this is, you are the kind of person who rushes fists first through all obstacles. Obviously, we see Susie do that. The second she separates from us in Chapter 1, she goes right, she pummels through the enemies we have to sort of try and catch up with her with Ralsei, but we see that she is the type of person who rushes fists first through all obstacles. Some more evidence, actually, and this is a strange connection I drew to Undertale, is that when in a scene at the end of Chapter 2, when Queen is describing sort of the attributes of all the heroes, she brings up Susie and she says her foolish bravery. Obviously, bravery, again, associates Susie with the Orange Soul, but also the decision to call it foolish bravery is interesting because if you look down here, it actually seemingly would be a callback to this first puzzle in the ruins. Only the fearless may proceed. Brave ones, foolish ones, both walk not the middle road. So obviously, apparently, if Susie is assumed to be brave, she would also be fearless, which I could see. She might have some fears, but for the most part, she is a fearless person. She could also be seen as a foolish one, and I'll circle back to the foolish part, but also want to go back to the walking not the middle road part, because it is very interesting, because this is the design of Susie's Rude Buster, and it is also reused on her carpet, but it actually, I mean, obviously, it just seems to be a microphone effect, but it is interesting that it is the exact same symbol that is used for the Act button in Undertale, and this symbol is reused for the Act button in Deltarune. And obviously we see that Susie gains access to an S action, and then forces Ralsei to gain access to R action, which goes against what would be sort of considered the middle road, or like the intended way for the story to play out, which is that each character in the party of the main three has their own sort of job. So Chris obviously is the only one who can act, being a human, and so their special talent is acting. Susie's and Ralsei's special talent is magic, with Susie being more damage dealing and Ralsei being more healing. But when Susie does eventually learn S action of her own volition, it sort of perturbs Ralsei, and he sort of is against it. He says, no, acting is Chris's special ability, which is certainly interesting because it seems Ralsei sort of is trying to keep the game on track, which may or may not come of anything. Obviously, we have had our suspicions in the community about Ralsei, and they may or may not be revealed to be anything, but I want to go back to this. The second option, which is obviously brave ones or foolish ones, I want to sort of recontextualize it and think of the ways that we have sort of been breaking the intended route of the story. The first one, which would be represented by brave ones, is how Susie does it, which is just by sort of doing her own thing. She has made several decisions for us. She has sort of invalidated a lot of our answers. The main ones I think of, obviously, are when she learns actions on her own, and obviously also in the trash dump in the cyber world, when she chooses to go with Ralsei instead of giving us the choice of who to go to, which was what Ralsei originally wanted us to do, but then Susie chooses. So it's sort of a brave way to steer off of the middle road. But there's also the foolish way, which theoretically, in my head, I immediately just associate that with the Snowgrave route. Like, it would be a foolish way to steer off the middle road, because instead of having this nice adventure, you're sort of, you're killing everyone. Just plain and simple. So that's a way I could interpret that. I would find it really cool if it did end up sort of holding some weight in future chapters. It would sort of be a full circle moment from Deltarune all the way back to the first puzzle in Undertale. That's all I have for Susie, unfortunately. As well, there's not a ton of evidence, but there's just enough to suggest. Obviously, if there was more, it would be. You could take it a step further and sort of be like, Chris has a blue soul, and Susie has an orange soul. We haven't seen it, but I'm just going to say, and this is sort of as well evidence for just the metaphoricality of, I don't know if that's a word, but just the traits being metaphorical, is because it's a good story technique. Like, if you can early on associate these colors with these traits, then you can reuse those traits or reuse those colors to portray traits. And the best example I can think of is Sans in his genocide fight. When he's throwing you against the walls, his eyes flash yellow and light blue, which obviously show judgment because you're in the judgment hall, and patience because he has the patience to sort of and it's at the end of his before this final attack, because it shows that he has the patience to theoretically sit eternally with you forever. Just another little tangent about Undertale, but it is very cool how these colors with these traits keep popping up everywhere, and it keeps fitting. So it's good thinking that we can pull these colors out where we see them, and they seem to be fitting. Now, obviously, theoretically, you would think Susie would be associated with purple. We'll get into that later. Next up, we want to talk about the third member of the party, who is Ralsei. We want to know, does Ralsei have a soul? Because Ralsei is a Darkener, and the way Darkener souls work is obviously completely unknown to us. In this one, Ralsei has a black soul, which could be just a Darkener soul, and in his Chapter 2 sprite, it's a bit changed. It just sort of looks like an arrow, but I'll assume that's just a design choice. It's still supposed to be a soul. Obviously, this is just Ralsei in a hood. So these are the 4 left, besides the red soul. I did not include that one because I couldn't find a 5th corner, but I don't think it's very likely that Ralsei would be represented by the yellow soul, and I don't think it's very likely that he would be represented by the blue soul either. So the 2 options that we are left with are the purple soul and the green soul. Now, early on, I was actually a huge advocate, obviously in my own head, I wasn't talking to anybody about it, but I was a huge advocate for Ralsei Purple Soul because it covers the purple soul, which seemingly you would think would be occupied by Susie, and there is actually a decent amount of evidence for it. I'll go over that real quick. The evidence, obviously, the purple soul and Ralsei's pink scarf are almost the same color. It's the same way that Chris's skin is almost the same light blue as the soul. It fits close enough, and the other evidence is that the cloudy glasses, as you see here, were worn, and this is a fan sprite, but they were worn by the purple soul, and you can see a couple places where Ralsei's glasses get cloudy or perhaps foggy. And obviously Ralsei wears glasses, and we've seen him without his glasses, and his eyes are bright pink, which is also more evidence for perhaps the pink or purple soul. I'd call it the purple soul. It might be pink, though. It's up to you. That it could be associated with Ralsei. As well, there's the torn notebook, which was also used by the purple soul human, which obviously Ralsei also has a book. And did I say the purple book? I meant the torn notebook is what this is called. And it's interesting because Ralsei's guide, which could also be a notebook, is actually, how do I put this? It can also be torn if you throw it away enough times. It says you throw it onto the ground and the pages scatter into the wind. So it could be drawing a parallel between the notebook and the guide and the glasses and Ralsei's glasses, which we have seen cloud up from time to time. Unfortunately, the evidence for the green soul is just way stronger. Let's get into it right now. First off, the burnt pan and the torn apron are both related to cooking and baking and food, which obviously is a huge part of Ralsei's character. He bakes cakes. As well, just the fact that he has kindness in his stats. He wears predominantly green. And as well, he is referred to multiple times by Lancer most of the time as Kind Boy. And the biggest evidence, obviously, keep going back to these flags. I'll stop talking about them when we've gone through all of them, but they provide great evidence, and the description of the Green Soul is that your concern and care for Ball led to a delicious victory. And if you assume Ball is the player, or if you assume Ball is the game, doesn't matter, because Ralsei shows great concern and care for the player and for the game with the way he's sort of trying to steer the path back on track, sort of trying to steer us back onto that middle road. It's very interesting. It works either way, no matter what you assume or associate Ball with. And this has led to a delicious victory. Obviously, it's associating with the cooking items that have been shown to be associated with the Green Soul. However, if you just put it in the context of Ralsei, delicious victory seems like absolutely an ending that we would have in Deltarune, or even in a chapter, because we've eaten some of his cakes before, or Susie downed a whole one. But anyway, that's basically all I got. There's also the fact that kindness was an option in the Goner Maker. That's more of just sort of, hey, it's a mention of kindness and bravery. And the important part is kindness, bravery, and then mind, ambition, voice. There's no real patience option, but bravery and kindness being there as the only 2 soul traits is interesting because it seemingly is the other 2 party members we play as. But anyways, that is all of the evidence that Ralsei is associated with the green kind soul. Now, this is also important here, as you see. In the core, there are 3 ways sort of to bypass to the end. There's a barricade right here, and there are 3 ways to get it to shut down so you can progress to the end. There's the warrior's path, which requires you, if you'll go back to here, it requires you to rush fist first through a bunch of obstacles in the form of core enemies, such as astigmatism and whatnot, all those guys. You have to rush fist first into it. And then there's the sage's path, which obviously a sage is sort of a magician, someone who can cast magic, which is greatly associated with Ralsei. It requires you to complete a puzzle, which is also very related to Ralsei because he sort of wants us to take the scenic route sort of and to do all the puzzles. He sort of enjoys, as we assume, the flow of the game, and he keeps it on track. Obviously, a big part of that is the puzzles in the game, so it could be associated with Ralsei as well. Obviously, the sage. Ralsei is the guy with the magic. Susie and Noel are sort of learning, gaining their skills, but Ralsei is the guy with the magic, so he could absolutely be associated with the sage's path. But the third path, shout out to Shay for calling this path to my attention, but is the sort of secret patience route, which is if you just, and the barrier isn't here, but if it's here, you just sort of stand at it, and it is a light blue barrier. It's a big laser, which obviously light blue is the color for patience, and with patience you make your way through. Patience, obviously, this is the most direct call. These 2 have been associated pretty easily with the characters, but this one specifically associates with the soul trait of patience, which obviously could do with the fact that it has to do with the light blue laser, but also it's interesting because you can associate it with with Chris. I cannot fight, I cannot think. I mean, look at that. Look at that emotionless stare. Anyways, just something I thought I'd bring up, that the 3 paths in the core seem to be very closely related to the 3 characters and their assumed soul traits, which I have just given decent evidence for. But we have to talk about the other souls, because there are 3 more souls in the sort of the 6 souls that have traits associated with them. The first one we're going to go over is the purple soul. Here are some possibilities I found, and their evidence. The dialogue is, even when you felt trapped, you took notes and achieved the end of ball. Obviously, we already listed Ralsei as a possibility. We've brought that all up. Susie is a possibility as well because of her color. She is a purple dinosaur. But she, obviously, as I've shown, she's much more closely associated with the trait of bravery. I picked 2 people from hometown. They're the only 2 people with the color pink or purple. I don't think Bratty's going to have any association with the purple perseverance soul, although you could say she's persevering through her shift at QC's as well, because she's a classmate. It could be a bit of evidence that she might become important later, although I'm going to completely discount this one. Obviously, Purple Guy, he is called Purple Guy, so there could be some connection there, but I'm going to assume not. This is just a side character. The association with Icy could be interesting, but I'm going to assume this is just a one-off joke character. As well, there's Muffet, who has not been seen in Deltarune, and I will assume does not exist in Deltarune, because she was a Kickstarter edition to the game, although I felt I would include her since her fight is the only one where we encounter the Purple Soul. As well, I included the Skelebros because it's for the sole reason of I found it interesting looking through the dialogue dump that both Papyrus and Sans mention the word perseverance. Papyrus says hard work and perseverance. I believe it's in relation to joining the Royal Guard. And then this is Sans at the end of his genocide route. He says there's no benefit to persevering whatsoever. So I just thought it was very interesting that both characters brought up the trait of perseverance, although do I think either of them especially are going to be I'm assuming that it's going to be the main characters that are going to be associated with these souls, and I don't think Sands of Papyrus are going to rise to the level of main characters. I believe they're almost definitely going to remain in the background. However, there's one option that I have neglected to show, and I'm going to bring it up now. It's Des. This is my opinion, and then I'm going to present it to you in theory form. I think it's very likely that Des could be represented by the Purple Soul if we assume that that we're going to end up with a cast of 6 or 7 characters, each associated with a soul that was foreshadowed in Undertale. I find it fitting for no one other than Des. I mean, look at this. Even when you felt trapped. And obviously we know Des, obviously from this guitar, is missing. And we know she's lost because the song is a cover of Lost Girl. And I would assume that if a person or a monster is lost, that they aren't just in a different town and they don't know the directions back to hometown. I would assume that they are, as it says down here, trapped. Many people assume that Des could be the person who is trapped in the code in Deltarune. Obviously, they're sort of talking to themselves in the code, assuming they are somewhere in some sort of dark world or in the bunker or a dark world in the bunker. We don't know exactly what happened with Des. We know little to nothing. So this is definitely the one with the least evidence. However, if I could see anybody turning out to be the representation of the Perseverance Purple Soul, I feel like Des is almost certainly in first place. This is obviously a fan sprite of Des. We do not even know what she looks like. We're almost certain she's alive because it's not referred to as if she's dead. We are obviously told multiple times that she's lost or that she's missing. But we don't even know what she looks like. All we know is that she's Noel's sister, and so we would assume that sort of these background hints that there's a larger mission that we need to find Des. They hint that Des is going to have some more significance than we have already seen. So hypothetically, she could in fact fill the role of the Purple Soul. That's all I'm going to talk about that one. Next up, we're going to talk about the Blue Soul. This one is Integrity. This is the Soul of Integrity. Obviously, again, we got the Skelebros, mostly because Sans says that someone who likes bad jokes has an integrity you can't say no to. Obviously, he says it, and he likes bad jokes, so it could mean him. He also uses the Blue Soul in his fight. But when he's talking about someone, he's specifically referring to Toriel having integrity, which I could see, but I honestly don't feel like Toriel will be joining the main roster of characters, although it is possible she will actually be playable in the Chapter 3 Dark World. We'll just have to see how that plays out. Another one I included is Snowy, because obviously Snowy is a classmate of ours and could rise to a more important role, and he does like bad jokes, and he does sort of have a bluish color scheme, especially being associated with Snowden. I also included Papyrus here because he obviously is the first instance we see of the Blue Soul. And this description, hopping and twirling your original style pulled you through, is obviously in Undertale a reference to the fact that the Blue Soul is the sort of ballet dancer with the shoes and the tutu. However, I think more than anybody, obviously, Birdley has to be the Blue Soul. For many reasons. First off, he's blue. Second off, he's a main character. We've seen him in Chapter 2. We didn't get to play as him, although there is the opportunity to have him join your party for one scene. Sort of. And the arc that he goes through that sort of implies that he will return as a changed person and maybe have a bigger role. Obviously, in his monologue, he turned blue and he becomes, or not, he doesn't become, but he describes his past as how he was a forgettable little bluebird. And specifically, this is important not just because he calls himself blue, because, I mean, he is blue, but also because later he references this sort of being forgettable, and he calls Chris a bluebird as well. He calls him a fellow bluebird, which is interesting because if you do go with the assumption that Chris is the light blue soul and Birdley is the blue soul, then they would be fellow bluebirds, or fellow blue, not blue souls, because they aren't actually the souls themselves. I personally don't think you could take it a step further and say that they are the souls or they will become them. But I think it's just metaphorical representation, sort of foreshadowing the future of Deltarune. this is even more important because this now association with blue we have with Birdley is even more important because obviously in here we have the, in the doctor's office, there's the bead toy that, I mean, if you've ever been to a doctor's office, you know exactly what this thing is. It's interesting that the three colors you see here are orange, blue, and green because those are obviously the three that we associated with the main three in our party, Chris, Susie, and Ralsei. However, in the Snowgrave route, after you presumably kill Birdley, he could just be extremely injured, but I'm going to assume he's dead. It says one of the blue beads is broken and torn off. Now, what's interesting is, obviously most people assume this is Birdley because the bead toy in Deltarune sort of represents, obviously as we talked about before, the middle road. It sort of goes hand in hand with this idea that you can't change the outcome. Your choices don't matter. That you're on this set path. You begin in chapter 1 and you always end, no matter what you do, in the same place. Now, obviously, the Snowgrave route breaks so far off the main path that we obviously presumably kill who would be one of the main characters. And a lot of people say that the blue bead actually isn't Birdley, that it's Chris, because Chris obviously is broken by what we have caused Noel to do. However, I think it's Birdley. Now, obviously, the reason people say it's Chris is because there's obviously orange, green, and blue, and that has to be Chris, Susie, and Ralsei. However, notice it says one of the blue beads, which seems to imply that there are multiple blue beads, which means, hypothetically, if we zoomed in, this is obviously a low render, but if we zoomed in, there could be 6 or 7 different colors, with 2 of them being different shades of blue. If one of the blue beads is broken and torn off, that can simply represent how, of the 6 or 7 characters who are meant to make up our sort of main party, one of them, Birdley, the blue soul, the blue bead, has been ripped off of the path. He can no longer make it to the end journey as he is dead. That's sort of a huge evidence, as well the fact that there are 2 blue beads and 2 blue souls. Obviously, there could be more than 2 blue beads, but I'm just going to assume that there's 2 because it fits my theory and you can't tell me not to. Anyways, that's all I have for the blue soul. Pretty confident on Birdley for this one. Obviously, last up of the 6, we got to go to the yellow soul. Your surefire accuracy put an end to the mayhem of Ball. Couple options. First off, we have Undyne here. Obviously, in this universe, she is a police officer. She would presumably be an arbiter of justice and carrying out the law. Her eyes are yellow, which is also interesting. So is her badge. That's about where the association ends. I feel like if Undyne was to be a main character, she would almost certainly be the green soul. That's, in fact, the soul that she uses in her battle in Undertale, so almost certain to count her off. Figured I'd mention Gerson as well, because in Undertale, apparently his nickname was the Hammer of Justice. Which obviously, justice is, I don't know if I said this, but justice is the trait of the yellow soul. As well mentioned Sans, because as I mentioned earlier, his eye can flash yellow. However, as I said for, I believe it was the blue soul, and the purple soul, so Sans has appeared for all of these. Unfortunately, I don't think he's a main character, so I don't think he can be represented by any of these souls. Obviously, his soul turns yellow in Undertale because he is judging you. You are in the Judgment Hall. But I don't think he's going to sort of be promoted to a main character in this piece. It would feel too fan servicey in my opinion, and I feel like the story doesn't need it. He's perfectly fine where he is, cracking jokes from the back, being a funny reference, maybe having a bit more to do with sort of the lore, but I don't think he should be joining the main group of characters. Down here we have 2 more. We have Alphys and we have Mettaton. I put Neo, but it could really be any version of Mettaton. Obviously, because Alphys designs the extension to your phone that allows you to actually turn your soul yellow, or at least to fire. And then Mettaton is obviously the one that you use the yellow soul against. So there's decent evidence for all of these characters, but Gerson is dead. Undyne seems to be a gag character, although she could be appearing in Chapter 3. Sans seems like a background character, Alphys seems like a background character, and Mettaton has been seen. But I feel like the chapter with the Yellow Soul, being Chapter 2, would have had more of an association with Mettaton. Obviously, we got Spant and Neo, and we did get to speak to Mettaton in their house. but I don't think there's enough evidence, and there is one character who has to be on the main cast who has not been associated with the soul yet. That is Noel, and this one is pretty obvious. I was kind of dancing around that fact. Obviously, and on the surface, there's not really much yellow to her character, but in the menu, her name and sort of anything associated with her is yellow. Her hair is yellow, and it's just the sort of the just behavior or treatment. I obviously put the definition of justice there because I do think she is a just person, and she is. We see Cinema there. Equity. She does try and keep sort of everything in her life equal. She sort of tries to be equally nice to everybody, and I think she has a pretty just character, at least in the main route. Obviously, she's the only person in our classroom who is willing to make a group of 3 for the group project, which I personally think everyone should have been, because, come on, more people equals less work per person. But Noel is the only person who, and she was kind enough, she was just enough to offer it to us. Obviously, it didn't end up falling through, but it is very interesting because, obviously, like I said before, with the sort of association of the Yellow Soul with Chapter 2. Chapter 2 is sort of where Noel gets her prominence. She is mainly featured there. We actually get to play as her and fight, act, use an item, or use mercy as her. And she was sort of integral to the story of Chapter 2, especially she was heavily associated with Queen. We've later learned that she was heavily associated with Spamton Neo, who we obviously used the Yellow Soul against. I think Metaton or Alphys is almost 100% the one who designed the Neo body, but Noel has, as we've learned in the Spamton Sweepstakes, a deep history with Spamton, so there's obviously a huge correlation here. We've also associated her with the word justice. Let's take one last look at this flag, though. Your surefire accuracy put an end to the mayhem of Ball. The mayhem of Ball could be the mayhem of the game, the mayhem of the player, the sort of the actions we choose. Noel has been said by Queen to be very powerful, although that power is sort of lying underneath something, probably her shyness and her, you know what I'm saying? But we know that she's very powerful. Obviously in the Snowgrave route, she gains power quite quickly, although in a main pacifist neutral or no mercy route, she could still be gaining her power, as we'll presumably be seeing her in repeating in chapters, probably not in chapter 3 Dark World, but in future Dark World she could absolutely show up in any one of them, mainly because we don't know where any of them are going to be, except chapter 4 probably at the church, which Noel would obviously be there, and she has heavy associations with the angel. But putting all that aside, the point is that putting it into the mayhem of Ball could be seen as Noel saving the day, Noel being sort of the one who maybe frees Chris from our possession in either route, in the Snowgrave route or in a main route. Speaking of the Snowgrave route, it is a little odd that Noel would be associated with justice, even in a route where she obviously is. It's the Snowgrave route. You might could make the argument that it's not terribly just to freeze an entire civilization of people and kill your best friend. However, you gotta look at the context of Snowgrave, and you gotta realize it's just ice. That would be such a sweet mic drop to end the video on, but unfortunately there's a little bit more I want to talk about. First off, I do want to bring up everything we've gone over. So these are, and I should have put them actually in the order I had them at the beginning, but this is sort of, I centered them around the main cast. So obviously Chris and Susie in the middle, and then Ralsei and Noel, secondary most important characters, and then Birdley and, what's her name? Des on the outside, although anyone could switch out except for probably Chris and Susie. Pretty solid there in the middle. Anyways, I'm just reminding you all what we associated all of them with. As you can see in each of these characters, there is a heavily correlation. Just looking at the soul, you can see blue and blue, green and green, light blue and light blue, orange and orange, yellow and yellow. The only one you can't really see is purple with Des. Obviously, this is a fan sprite because we don't know what Des looks like. If we see Des in a chapter, or we see a flashback of Des and she's wearing purple, I'm going to take that as confirmation that this entire theory is true, and you can't stop me. Anyways, I did want to go over some bonus souls, so we got a couple extra souls. Obviously, the main one is the red soul. So it's possible that we could be seeing a reappearance of Frisk or Kara in Deltarune. It's highly unlikely, but if they were to reappear, they would almost certainly, and if you assume that this sort of soul association, the whole shebang, is correct, then you could say that the association between either of these characters with the red soul would be way strong enough to almost certainly, it would be a huge misstep to include either one of these characters and include this soul association and not bring the red soul to associate with whichever one. There's also obviously the possibility that it's associated with Chris. Although that does contradict the association with the light blue soul, it is still entirely possible that Chris, because obviously Chris is being possessed by the red soul, we'd then have to find another sort of vessel for what would be associated with the light blue soul, which I don't think that you're going to find anybody with more evidence than Chris, although I dare anyone in the comments to find a better association with any of these souls, with another character, to find a better association. If you do, hats off to you. I'll be sure to pin your comment or something. Anyways, it could also be, the red soul could also be associated with the goner that we discarded at the beginning. Obviously, we see that the red soul seemingly was intended for this vessel before it was discarded and perhaps placed inside Chris, or maybe we inhabited Chris instead of the goner, and the goner got to keep the soul. Because if you do assume that every soul is red, it could just be possible that that was the goner's soul, and we instead decided to inhabit Chris's soul, who, instead of, like, this vessel could be like a newborn, so we just, essentially, it's a blank slate. We can shape however we want by inhabiting its soul. However, Chris is obviously a person with a backstory, so taking over their life, sort of way more disruptive than, say, taking over the life of an empty vessel. The one I would say the most, though, most likely to be associated with the red soul is you, the player. Obviously, I've said it before, but this dialogue, obviously we've been able to associate all of the flag dialogues very heavily with the character of my choosing. Try as you might, you continue to be yourself. As I mentioned earlier in the video, heavily relates to the player. You continue to be yourself, obviously just straight up telling you that the red soul would be associated with you if you assume that these are attempting to correlate in association. And try as you might, obviously, as I talked about before, it would seem to suggest that you're trying to be someone else. Obviously, you, the player, you've tried to be Frisk, you've tried to be Chris, you've tried to be the vessel, presumably you've tried to be every other character in every video game you've ever played. So, if Toby Fox does decide to take the sort of narrative route of that, which he could not, it would be fine. I'm going to love the game either way, but if he does, that could certainly be a great way to parallel it, especially if any of these lines, hopefully all, got directly quoted or brought back up in Deltarune, because that would just make my heart float. Because then my video would probably get more views in the future, because people would go back to be like, no way bro predicted it. Which, if you're watching after Chapter 7, hi, I knew all of this was going to come true. My uncle works at Toby Fox. Anyways, that's all I have really for the Red Soul. Next up, I just want to talk about, this is in no way canon or confirmed soulless. Obviously, there are soulless routes, which were fan-named, but obviously Kara does take your soul at the end of the genocide route, if you choose to give it to them. So we could associate soulless with the goner if you assume that the red soul that we use to control Frisk is actually not Chris's own soul. I might have said Frisk, but you know what I mean. If that soul is not Chris's own soul, that it could be the exact same soul that was meant to inhabit the goner, meaning the goner could be soulless. As well, Ralsei, obviously, which we said before, has a black soul. This is more likely a darkener soul, which may or may not be actually real. Again, it could all be metaphorical, but it could also mean that Ralsei is soulless. Obviously, there are heavy associations between Ralsei and the devil, which I'd rather not get into now, because looking at him, he's just a cute little fluffy boy, but somebody can tell you about those. Obviously, there's the whole goat thing and the devil, and, you know, Ralsei is sort of this manipulator. He manipulates you into following the path of the game. I said it anyway. I might have a mental disorder. Anyway, the last one that I wanted to sort of mention is Gaster. Obviously, Gaster being soulless, if you don't know, is completely a work of fanon. It's not ever confirmed that Gaster's soul was removed from his body. It's all we know is that he fell into his creation, presumably the core, and was shattered across time and space. It doesn't say he lost his soul or his soul died. I'm not saying that it doesn't work in certain fan fictions and fan works, but in the official canon of Undertale and Deltarune, we don't know that he's soulless, but I figured I'd put him because I can't make a theory about Undertale and not include the funny Gaster man, the funny bone man. It all ties back to him. I'm surprised I actually went this long in a theory without mentioning him. Any sort of a footnote at the end. I'm very proud of myself for that one, actually. And obviously, there are monster souls, which we know exist in Undertale. They could exist in Deltarune. If you can't tell, this is just a joke category. Like this one has a bit. This one's crap. But this one is real. These are all the monsters. They could be associated with the monster soul. This is everyone that could be. This is everyone that's not a monster. Obviously, you got Chris, and at the bottom here we have potential maybes. I don't know if Toby Fox is a dog monster or if he's actually just a metaphorical representation of Toby Fox. Maybe the dog being metaphorical could be a metaphor for the soul being metaphorical, and him being white could be a metaphor for the monster soul being white. And we also don't know about Ralsei, because it's possible that Ralsei is a Lightner. That's not a theory I want to go into huge right now, but there's definitely a little bit of evidence, given that Lightners can use magic, and that's essentially what Ralsei does. Anyways, that's about all I have to say for this video. I'm beginning to ramble, so I'm now going to just move on to the last slide. It's just a real quick credits to everyone who sort of made this slideshow in this video possible. Toby Fox, obviously, for creating the game. This is Timmy Chang, who did a lot of the art, and this is my friend Yuti. What did they make? They made, oh god, it was the lasers that I used near the beginning of the slideshow. I couldn't find good sprites of them anywhere, so I asked her to just make them for me real quick, and she did it really quick. Always making sprites when I need them. Go check out her channel. She actually recently blew up with the Dusttale videos. You should go check those out, by the way. Those are peak Undertale fan work. But anyways, I just want to thank you all so much for watching this sort of crackpot theory. But at the end of the day, if your theory isn't a crackpot theory, is it really a theory, or are you just saying things? Anyway, thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Subscribe if you did. Stick around to see me go bald, hopefully. I love you all. Thank you for watching my channel, and I'll see you on the next one. Peace!